Well, Moderna has a new COVID flu vaccine combo. They think it's going to be a big hit. They think these two things go together, like chocolate and peanut butter, like rice and beans, like, I don't know, honey, any?
Chocolate and peanut butter.
I just did that one.
Like rice and beans.
I did that one too. Nothing? Okay. Thought we could have a little fun with this. So COVID flu combo, you guys order that. That's a number 2 at McDonald's. They say they have finished phase 3 of their clinical trials, and they're pretty happy with it. We're going to go over what we do know from that. Well, let's take a look at what they say is a positive trial. They're not saying, well, let's go over what they're saying and what they're not saying, because there's a lot. So here's what Moderna tells us in this Moderna announcement. And look at the headline. Moderna announces positive phase 3 data for combination vaccine against influenza and COVID-19. Now, you can read this for yourself. It's on their site. It is not the full report of the clinical trials. They're saying, we did the trials, they're positive. You can't download them for yourself, though. We cannot read them. We can only take away what they've summarized for us, because they will not present the full trials until what they say is an upcoming medical conference. Now, clinicaltrials.gov gives a deadline of June 14th. For when this data will be published, but most of the deadlines on clinicaltrials.gov just come and go, and they blow right past them. So clinicaltrials.gov is a not serious place for data, because a lot of times they'll say this trial should have been published this day, but it's not. This happens all the time because I read these a lot. Okay, what do we know? First of all, is it safe? Well, here's what they tell us about safety. They're saying that this vaccine is called mRNA. Catch that, mRNA, we're going to get to that. 1083 showed an acceptable tolerability and safety profile. Acceptable, you say? I mean, that is open for interpretation, don't you think? So acceptable to who? Acceptable to Moderna? Acceptable to the government? I mean, there should be some kind of threshold that you have to pass.
If I tell
you government approval,
if you were driving us and I said, honey, I think your driving is acceptable, would you be flattered or be insulted by that?
No. And, I mean, is this now how we're going to be able to pass things in life? Like, I didn't pay that bill, but I paid an acceptable amount. I didn't pay my taxes, but I felt like it was an acceptable amount of payment.
Right.
So let's look. Okay. Since we don't have a baseline, we don't have these numbers yet. Let's look at what Moderna considered acceptable for their first COVID vaccine that was rolled out in 2020. Well, we went over this study in the summer of 2023. This comes from the Department of Cardiology and Cardiovascular Research in Switzerland. This is the title page. They found that 1 in 5 doses of the Moderna booster resulted in myocarditis. 1 in 5. Is that acceptable? Would you have taken that gamble if they told us that? If they, if that's what you knew before going into the Moderna vaccination? Another study in 2022 in the Journal of the American College of Cardiology shows that the risk of myocarditis was higher for recipients of the Moderna vaccine than the Pfizer vaccine for COVID. Moderna has since admitted these problems, but they still maintain that it's better to risk this and get the COVID vaccine than not, even though COVID death numbers and hospitalization numbers are extremely low. They still want you to get it. So does this new COVID flu combo vaccine prevent either the flu or COVID or serious infection or hospitalization or death? They don't say any of that. It looks from what little data we have that they did not test for that. They don't even have manipulative words to indicate that it either stops transmission or stops severe reaction or infection. We don't know that. All it does say is that it does provide a higher immune response than the licensed comparator vaccines used in the trials. So here's where it says that. What that means is that the people who took this new vaccine had higher antibody counts in their blood than people who took something else. And that something else was the Florax influenza vaccine, and then Spikevax, which is Moderna's COVID vaccine. So the people who took one combination had higher antibodies than the people who took these two shots separately. Now, recall that the original trials for the COVID vaccine never tested if it prevented infection, even though they led us to believe that it did. It also didn't really test for hospitalization or death or anything like that. All they counted was symptoms. When somebody was vaccinated, did they then sneeze or have a fever or cough within the upcoming weeks that they followed up with them, which was just a short period of time. So
can we back up for a second?
Yeah.
Let's back up.
So if I understand the way they did this trial, they compared a combination vaccine of mRNA, which basically is going to create antibodies. That's what it does. It goes to the ribosome, makes antibodies, and they tried it against they tested it against people who took a single dose of one vaccine or a single dose of another vaccine.
No,
did they take both of those?
They took both separate. So either you took the combo or you took them separate, and then they tested the antibodies.
Okay, gotcha.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Someone in our chat says, no name says, acceptable means barely made it in school.
Right. Yeah.
D. Yeah.
Yeah. So again, we don't know if the people who took this combination were less likely to get sick. We don't know if they were less likely to contract either COVID or the flu or be hospitalized or die. All we know is that their blood antibody count was higher, and that's it. Also, this is clearly not a true placebo trial because they were given, the placebo group was given something very similarly formulated. So, I don't know. And consider that when you are asked to take it, because you will be asked to take it by politicians. And again, their idea of acceptable safety is dubious at best. And again, we don't know if it prevents any symptoms or infection. Now, Moderna is also running full steam ahead with its RSV vaccine. And the RSV vaccine is the first non-COVID vaccine to have mRNA technology. So this mRNA technology, which was never used before the COVID vaccine, is popping up other places, just like we thought it would. And it's now in this RSV vaccine. So we now have, we've been covering the RSV vaccines at length recently because they have been launched now by Pfizer and GlaxoSmithKline. We now have them for elderly people. We have them for pregnant women. And then we have treatment for babies as well. It's not really a vaccine. So here's what we know now about the Moderna vaccine that they've been rushing to market. It's called mRESVIA. This one is for adults aged 60 and up. And again, they're pretty excited about the fact that it is the first mRNA vaccine that is not a COVID vaccine. Now, here's what Dr. Peter McCullough says about this. He is not excited to see mRNA pop back up. He says that their press release doesn't tell the public that the absolute risk reduction was below 1%. That's true when you look at their data, but we're going to get to that in a second. And consumers should know that. Also, myocarditis is related to mRNA of all types, he says. And so the autoimmunity, because of the regeneration of foreign RSV proteins and frame-shifted peptides are shown. And so, there's a lot to look at here. And we've talked about this a lot, the relative risk of RSV for certain populations. I had a small baby with RSV, my middle daughter, when she was 6 months old. But again, given these safety protocols, I wouldn't have tried to avoid that experience with these vaccines, and I'm going to show you why. Now, these trials do not show a lower risk of hospitalization from RSV. They only tested whether or not people were more likely to contract RSV and have 2 to 3 symptoms. So you can have RSV and stay home and not be hospitalized. So, you can have RSV and do pretty well with treatment. So here's what they're saying. Their trials showed that people who took the vaccine were less likely, between 60 and 80%, to have what's called an LRTD, or lower respiratory tract disease caused by RSV. So you see here that on the right side is like people who took the placebo, how many people had these infections with 2 or more symptoms or 3 or more symptoms, and they give it to us between 60 and 80%. Now, given that this does not say that you're less likely to be hospitalized or die from RSV, it doesn't say anything about really severity or hospitalization or death that was prevented. It was only contraction with 2 symptoms. Would you take it knowing that there is a 7% risk of a serious adverse events? This is from their black label on this vaccine, saying serious adverse events throughout the study were reported between 7.8 and 7.9% of the participants. And one participant in the group that got it had a serious adverse events of facial paralysis with onset 4 days after vaccination, assessed as related to MRSV. So facial paralysis. Now it's one person, right? So it still seems like maybe a low likelihood, but these are similar adverse reactions to what we've seen from other mRNA vaccines. So, okay, let's keep that in mind. And if we look again at the efficacy chart, you can see that it's broken out. See at the top, it says 3.7 months follow-up, and then below that 8.6 month follow-up. And then if you go further to the right, you see that the efficacy drops. So what this clearly tells us is that immunity wanes over time in a quite short period of time, actually. So it's like, that's like one flu season between 3 and 8 months, right? And so what that tells us is that we are looking at another mRNA vaccine that they will want to sell you every 6 months or so. Okay. I don't know. There's no other way to interpret this. Am I right or am I right? So this will be big money for them. That's why, because they're so bullish on RSV, that's why GlaxoSmithKline is making a big enough investment to hire Magic Johnson to tell you all about it at major sporting events. Recall this ad that was launched last year.
I make my health a priority, and I'm passionate about inspiring others to do the same. I've teamed up with GSK to help bring education and awareness around a common contagious virus called RSV. Understanding how to help protect yourself against this virus is important, especially for older adults who are at an increased risk for severe infection. My mission in life is to empower older adults to be their own health advocates by putting their health first. Know your risk to help sideline RSV.
Okay, why can they afford such an expensive marketing campaign? Now, this is GlaxoSmithKline that never had a COVID vaccine, so that's not from COVID profits. But why is Big Pharma so heavily invested in RSV? Well, it's because the 3 vaccine makers that are making RSV vaccines right now, Pfizer, Glaxo, and Moderna, are competing with what they estimate could be a $15 to $17 billion per year industry, which is RSV vaccines. So, okay, I've shown you the clinical trials. You make your own informed consent now, okay? So you decide if what they say is acceptable is what you think is acceptable, and I leave it in your hands.